So first of all, I want to say that I'm very honored to be invited to give the annual Yusuf Sair, if I can say that right, at the bottom of my throat, lecture. That is a great honor. And I want to also acknowledge the help from the British Council and especially from the Kenyon Institute, and even more so from Mandy Turner, who is the director of the Kenyon Institute. It's been an enormous project. You would be surprised how difficult it is to arrange a speaking trip of this kind, and Mandy has done a great deal of work in order to bring it about. So, I'm going to be talking about new industrial policy, and much of what I'm going to say is rather abstract. So I want to begin with what happened yesterday when we went to Hebron. We went to a shoe factory. This factory produces 500 high-quality shoes a day, which it sells entirely to Israel. It is supply constrained, not demand constrained. That is, it could easily increase its production. The factory was a mess. The factory looked like it came out of Charles Dickens' account of a factory in London in the 19th century. And quite a few years ago, in the 1980s, I visited shoe factories producing broadly similar kinds of shoes in Taiwan. But they were very much better laid out in terms of the production line, in terms of the equipment that they were using, and in terms of the working conditions. But this was not just due to the decisions of individual shoemaking entrepreneurs. This was due to sustained efforts by a small government agency called the Industrial Development Bureau, with roughly 150 engineers working for an economy with about 22 million people. So the point I'm making is that this was not a large agency. The agency was divided into sectors. Each sector had a team. One of the sectors was called daily necessities, so shoes were within the daily necessities sector, along with food and other such things. And the point is that it was part of the job description of these engineers. And by the way, this organization was established in the 1950s. It was part of the job description to go out and visit factories like the one we visited in Hebron yesterday for several days every month, year after year, decade after decade, and push or nudge the factory owners to upgrade their production, to improve their production layout, maybe to introduce a new kind of machine tool to improve productivity. And so you would not have found in the 1980s in Taiwan, the shoemakers in Taiwan, a factory like the one we saw in Hebron. And so it just raised to me the question of what is the Palestinian government doing in order to encourage the upgrading of Palestinian manufacturing. What we encountered yesterday in Hebron was a sort of a kind of, it was very close to defeatism. That is, China's imports are knocking us out of manufacturing, and therefore we in Palestine have to give up manufacturing and think of something else to do. And that seems to me premature for Palestine to just give up manufacturing, because there is a lot that could be done by the public sector, such as an equivalent agency to what is called the Industrial Development Bureau in Taiwan, to keep nudging Palestinian entrepreneurs to upgrade their production, the quality of their production, to diversify, and so on. So that's something very concrete. Now I want to go much more abstract, and I'll come back to more concrete things towards the end. And I'm going to begin with the development strategy as set out by Adam Smith in 1775. these are 40 famous words. You count the words, they equal 40. So he's basically saying development is very easy. That is to say, little else is required to carry a state to the highest degree of optimism from the lowest barbarism, but 3 conditions: peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of events. And in case you think that nobody today believes this, let me say that Gregory Mankiw, a celebrated American economist, professor of economics at Harvard, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and the author of a very influential textbook in economics, said in the Wall Street Journal in 2006, Adam Smith was right to say this. So these ideas are provide justification. Even though they were first formulated in 1755, they still provide justification for what has become, ever since the 1980s, the sort of standard development strategy promoted by the World Bank, but promoted by many other development agencies as well. The core idea from which everything else follows is the proposition that the market is the preferred mechanism rather than the state for achieving human ends, except in particular conditions where there may be market failures. Then there might be a case for government intervention just to fix those market failures, but other than that, the market, there's a strong presumption in favor of the private sector, the decentralized private sector, solving whatever problems there are to be solved, not the state. So the goal of the state development strategy is allocative efficiency and price stability. And the assumption is that when there is allocative efficiency and price stability, then there will be economic growth. Notice that what is missing in this idea of allocative efficiency, that's efficiency of allocation of existing resources. What is missing is the idea of efficiency in generating new resources, like innovation, for example. That is missing from the basic idea of allocative efficiency. Nevertheless, that's the goal of the development strategy. So the role of government has been, in this approach, this neoclassical or sometimes called neoliberal approach, has been summarized as get the prices right. But get the prices right does not mean that the government gets the prices. It means that the government opens the economy to the international economy, and then whatever prices are in the domestic economy, when it is in completely free trade with the international economy, those must be the right prices because they're not distorted prices. And if the prices are right, then growth will follow more or less automatically, as Adam Smith suggested. And so you get this package of measures: export-led growth, deregulation, free trade, suppression of labor costs, and so on. And the assumption is that if you have these things in place, if you set the dials of the economy so that these things are met, then growth will follow. Well, I want to raise some doubts about this very standard strategy that we have heard from development agencies around the world, at least in the West, including the World Bank, ever since the 1980s, the early 1980s, when the great neoliberal revolution with Reagan and Thatcher kicked in. The first set of doubts comes from the answer to this question: how many non-Western countries have become developed over the past 200 years? And my suggestion is that however much you stretch the categories of non-Western and country and developed, you get less than 10. And my list would include, remember it's the last 200 years, my list would include, first of all, Japan. Japan in the 19th century, when the Japanese government was very afraid that America would take Japan as a colony, and this mobilized the Japanese elite to really mount a very successful development strategy. And then Russia, again I'm stretching the category of non-Western. Then the post-war success stories: South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Again, I'm stretching the category of country by calling Hong Kong a country and a non-Western country. There's Singapore, that's 6, and one more I would add, Israel. So that's 7. And it's pretty difficult to get more than about 7 over 200 years. And the point that I'm making by this question and answer is that development is very difficult. It's not at all like what Adam Smith said. And it's not going to happen by free market forces. Basically, that's the lesson. These catch-up countries have not stuck closely to the neoliberal recipe that the World Bank has been promoting very energetically since the 1980s. We can come back to the third question at the end. And then there's a second set of doubts, which is about the wisdom of a continued emphasis on export-led growth. The point being that export-led growth encourages firms and governments to keep wages low. Export-led growth, when this is the dominant strategy, leads government and others to see wages only as a cost, not as also a source of demand. And so one's likely to find rising levels of income inequality and wealth inequality associated with export-led growth. And then also demand in the high-income countries is likely to remain suppressed for quite a while. So the point I want to make is that there is not, as there is often assumed to be, a sharp distinction between export-led growth and import-substituting industrialization. In East Asia, the governments did both at the same time. They promoted exports. They also very energetically promoted import replacement. And I will give you a concrete example of this energetic effort to promote import replacement at the same time as export promoting in a moment. What is completely missing from this whole approach to development, this whole way of seeing the development task, is the idea that development is essentially about production transformation, the transformation of production systems. This whole approach leaves out the idea of improving the firm and societal capabilities. Certainly it leaves out the idea of improving firm-level capabilities, as in the case of the shoe factory in Hebron that I mentioned. And so the question is, how can we go about using public policy to improve production capabilities, marketing capabilities? And this is one way to think of the task, which is very different from the neoclassical or the Adam Smith kind of way of conceiving of development. This is a really crude idea of a production ladder divided into stages, steps, beginning with simple manufacturing, perhaps with FDI and foreign guidance for domestic firms, then moving to the development of supporting industry with technology obtained from licensing, from spillovers from foreign firms operating in the territory. The third stage, domestic firms are fully capable of producing high-quality goods. And the fourth stage, domestic firms are able to innovate both in processes and products. So this is a really crude idea. And of course, it has to be complemented. The idea of the ladder, the product ladder, has to be complicated with another vector, which is the quality vector. That is, it's possible to upgrade within each of these steps by improving the quality of production. And the next point to make is that it is, and this is really just repeating the point I've made already, it is really difficult to move up these steps. The escalator is not at all smooth. And in fact, some analysts identify what they call a glass ceiling at various points in the ladder. Some identify a glass ceiling between stages 2 and 3. And that's because it's really difficult. This is the stage of moving from the development of supporting industry to the stage where domestic firms are fully capable of producing high-quality goods. This is because it's really difficult for firms to upgrade quality, and yet there is now good evidence that the quality of, for example, a machine tool makes a huge difference to the price that the machine tool can be sold at. And I'll give you one example from India, which was worked on by my colleague at LSE, John Sutton. John Sutton was able to identify factories in India where the same operator was using machine tools produced in India and in Taiwan. The machine tools were doing the same thing. It's just that some were produced in India and some in Taiwan. He got the operators to keep a detailed record of the breakdowns of the machine. Breakdowns not due to electricity failure, but breakdowns due to the machines themselves, to use this as an index of quality, the quality of the machine. And he found that the quality of the Indian-made machines was about 3% less than the Taiwan-made machines. That is, the Indian machines were out of action roughly just 3% hours per year more than the Taiwan machines. And he used some other indexes of quality as well, and they indicated the same thing. That is, there was a tiny difference in the quality, but that tiny difference in the quality of the machine tools, the Indian ones being lower than the Taiwanese ones, made a huge difference to the price. Because the Indian machines were slightly less good in terms of quality, they could only sell on the market at a price 25% below the Taiwan-made machines. So that's how much difference this small difference in quality made to the price of the machines. And so this point about quality is really important. For manufacturing to be upgraded in Palestine, anywhere else, there has to be a real big emphasis on quality. And so, yes, I'm talking now about the middle income trap. That is the point that movement up this product ladder is not smooth. There is at least one middle income trap. There may be more than one middle income trap. Other analysts say that the middle income trap kicks in at about a GDP per capita of $17,000 in constant 2005 prices. And this middle income trap corresponds to the move from 3 to 4. That is, the move into innovation-intensive activities. It's very difficult for firms, even firms that are able to produce very high-quality goods. It's very difficult for them to move into innovation. So that's another kind of middle-income trap. But there's a third middle-income trap, which is rather different from the other two that I just mentioned. And you could call it the global political economy middle-income trap. And it has to do with the consequences of the rise of China. The rise of China is very good for commodity exporters, that is, for the owners of assets which are producing commodity exports, such as the owners of soy farms in Brazil, or rubber farms, or the owners of timber. It's very good for them because there's a huge demand for these things in China. But the rise of China is very bad for manufacturing and very bad for employment generally, because it's knocking out manufacturing across many countries. Just a case in point, you will know about the famous Brazilian festival called Carnival, where Brazilians dress up in very fancy costumes. Well, until about 10 years ago, all these costumes were made in Brazil by the Brazilian textile industry. But within the last 10 years, all this has been displaced, and now the costumes are made mostly in China and imported into Brazil because the Chinese imports are cheaper. And that's good, of course, for the people who want to buy the costumes, but it's equally bad for the people who have lost their jobs and probably have not found other jobs. And of course, these two sets of people may be one and the same. The people who want to buy the costumes are also the people who've been knocked out of a job in producing the carnival costumes. And the point is that this kind of thing is happening across the board. I was amazed in Hebron yesterday to learn that the famous Palestinian scarf made of cotton in Palestine sells for 25 shekel, and the competing, made of cotton, and the competing Chinese import made of nylon sells for 10. So there's a huge price difference between 10 and 25. And that's one main reason why the Palestinian textile industry is being knocked out. So this point that I'm making, that the rise of China is not just good for some parts of developing countries, it's very bad for other parts. This point is generally not made, and of course, in any Chinese audience, they hate to hear this because they believe firmly that the rise of China is somehow good for everybody. It's not. And there's a question of how a country can implement a trade policy which will allow its manufacturing to survive and even perhaps flourish in conditions of competition with Chinese producers. That's a big issue in the WTO. So all this brings me, this emphasis upon the difficulties of development, the middle income trap, or traps, brings me to the question of industrial policy. IP is industrial policy. IP, industrial policy, means that the state gives selective assistance to some sectors, and that means it favors some sectors ahead of others. And so it is distinct from macroeconomic and exchange rate policy. It's distinct from microeconomic deregulation, distinct from horizontal policies, such as, for example, let's say a subsidy to R&D, meaning that R&D in any sector gets the same amount of subsidy. That's a horizontal policy. And it's distinct from social policy. Now, that's what I mean by industrial policy. Mainstream economics warns very strongly against industrial policy. I gave a talk at the World Bank in 2005 about industrial policy. I was invited by some personal friends of mine who are interested in these sets of issues. And I was introduced by a managing director at the bank, in other words, just below the president of the bank, very senior official, who warned the audience that what I was about to say, he didn't know what I was about to say, except he knew that I was keen on industrial policy. He warned the audience what I was about to say was very controversial and did not represent any thinking within the World Bank. And the World Bank has been dead against industrial policy to the point where you couldn't even use the phrase, or you could only use the phrase in a negative way. That is, everybody knows that industrial policy is a bad thing, until very recently. And by very recently, I mean like the last 2 or 3 weeks, when there was a conference held at the bank about industrial policy. And this was quite a change. Let me give some examples of how emphatically economists have said. When I say economists, I mean especially Anglo-economists, especially neoclassical economists, mainstream economists, have said, don't do industrial policy. This is Gary Becker, who of course won the Nobel Prize in economics. The best industrial policy is none at all. This is The Economist, which is absolutely reliable in opposing industrial policy, but it did have an article about innovation policy, but it managed to reduce innovation policy to free market policy. This is Lawrence Summers. The government is a crappy venture capitalist. Lawrence Summers likes pithy words of that kind, crappy. John Williamson, the coiner of the phrase the Washington Consensus, little in the record of industrial policy suggests the state is very good at picking winners. Notice that he is equating industrial policy with picking winners. What I described for Taiwan shoemakers is not picking winners. It's a very different thing, but it is industrial policy. The Economist again, the government has a terrible record of picking winners. I did research in the bank in 2010, and I was interested in what the bank thought of the ideas of Justin Lin, who was then the chief economist, a Chinese, the first ever chief economist of the World Bank, not from the G7 countries. And he was promoting what he called new structural economics, which is a very mild form of industrial policy. And I asked quite a number of economists in the bank what they thought of his new structural economics, his very mild form of industrial policy. And this is the consensus response that I got, quote, from an economist in his own vice presidency, by the way, quote, for every Korea, there are 100 failures. Who would you put your money on? Question mark. And again, notice the implication that industrial policy means doing what Korea did. And if you don't do what Korea did, then it's not somehow industrial policy, and you shouldn't do what Korea did because Korea had special circumstances and nobody else can follow Korea. It's all mostly complete nonsense. Mostly. And this is why, to put the argument in an abstract way, the point is that market signals give signals for incremental change, but they can block larger economic diversification and innovation. The core capitalist logic, the logic of the capitalist firm, is no profit, no production. No production, no employment. No employment, no income. But the key starting point is no profit, no production. Well, typically, in the case of making large non-incremental changes, like Korea going from making textiles and radios in the 1960s, going into steel, no private entrepreneur is going to make such a big jump because the prospect of profits is much too unclear. It's too much in the future. It's too uncertain. And therefore, because the prospects of profits are not clear, there won't be that move. But in retrospect, it was clearly desirable for the Korean economy to make big jumps of that kind out of the labor-intensive products that it was concentrating on in the 50s and 60s. And these big jumps were much accelerated, at least, by a state vision of the future growth of the economy that would be necessary to bring Korea into a high-income category and with a strong enough industry to provide a strong military base for opposing North Korea. That was part of the logic of South Korea's development. And so, going on from that, what an economy produces today determines the skill and comparative advantage of tomorrow. And that, as I've just been saying, that mechanism is external to the thinking of a private profit-seeking entrepreneur. This is something that the state needs to take hold of in terms of a vision of the future and imparting directional thrust, a thrust in a certain direction, in a way that private entrepreneurs won't do. And so this is the point. Government can help steer resource allocation to shape the comparative advantage of tomorrow. Comparative advantage in manufacturing, also in high value-added services, is substantially man-made. It's not something that comes simply from nature. Let me give a very schematic account of the history of industrial policy. Before the Second World War, there were some very remarkable cases of catch-up using a lot of industrial policy instruments, including trade protection. I've mentioned two here, the US and Germany. There's one obvious thing that I left out. The third case is Japan. And then after the Second World War, you have the East Asian cases in which, in all of them, except I left out Hong Kong because Hong Kong is something of an anomaly. It was an entrepot, it was a trading island, and so it's really quite exceptional. But anyway, in the other cases, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, the state had an explicit strategy to build up firm and societal production and marketing capabilities, including by using protection, targeted subsidies, FDI, and forced marriages between FDI and domestic firms. So I want to say a bit more about how East Asian countries use trade protection. The point being that you can look across developing countries in Latin America, in India, but also in New Zealand, and you can see trade protection being used very badly. And so economists have tended to say you should never use trade protection. My answer to that is this: trade protection, like any powerful policy instrument, can be used badly. It it often is used badly, it can also be used well. And the East Asians used a great deal of trade protection, but they used it differently than, for example, India or New Zealand or many Latin American countries. And the key difference was that they used protection with conditions. That is, they linked trade protection to performance conditions of the firms that were receiving protection, so that domestic firms were buffered from international competition, at least in the sectors that the government was trying to foster, but they were not isolated from international competition. Whereas, for example, in India, Indian automobile makers until the 1990s were completely insulated from international competition. The result was that Indian automobile makers replicated for decades after decade the 1955 British motor technology, the technology of 1955. They simply replicated it in the Ambassador motor car. And the reason was because there was no incentive to upgrade, because they were receiving very high levels of unconditional protection. Unconditional protection is what is wrong with protection, not protection itself. If protection is linked to performance conditions such that people know from the beginning that the protection will be withdrawn if they don't bring their price and quality into line with international competition, then protection can be a very powerful device for upgrading. And that's what happened in Taiwan. Firms were told, firms entering new products, new electronics products, were told, for example, that we will give you protection. It may be for 18 months, it may be for 2 years, whatever it may be. And if you can't get your VCRs up to the price and quality standard of international competitors, such as coming from Japan, then we will remove your protection. And that's what they did. And obviously there's a very difficult political economy issue of how you have an industrial policy agency which is able to withdraw the protection, which is autonomous enough from the firms that are being protected so that it can pull the protection away, even though the firms don't want it pulled away. Another thing that was done in East Asia, the state orchestrated what I call forced marriages between FDI and domestic firms. And I'll give you a concrete example. This concerns Philips in Taiwan. Philips was producing televisions. And for this purpose, it was importing a specialized glass from a Philips factory abroad. At a certain point, the officials of this industrial policy agency that I mentioned, the Industrial Development Bureau, which ran this kind of industrial extension service, analogous to an agricultural extension service that visited all the factories. At a certain point, the officials who were in charge of the glass sector or subsector decided that there were Taiwanese glass makers who could produce the specialized glass that Philips was using if Philips would give them a long-term supply contract and give them some technical help. So they went to Philips and they said, look, we have these firms, why don't you switch from importing to the domestic firms? And Philips said, no, thank you, we're very happy with our existing arrangements, so we're just going to continue. Well, the problem was that Philips and everybody else in Taiwan had to get imports authorized. Until this moment, the imports of specialized glass had been very quickly, automatically authorized. There was no problem. But you can guess what began to happen. When Philips said no, the permission to import the glass began to be mysteriously delayed. Philips went down to the Minister of Economic Affairs and said, look, we're having all these problems importing the glass. The minister said, I'm really sorry, our bureaucracy is terribly inefficient. I'll see what I can do. Of course, nothing happened. And to cut a long story short, what eventually happened was Philips did switch its source of supply to the domestic makers. The domestic makers upgraded their quality of glass and began to supply Philips, but they also fairly soon began to export. So this is an example of a point I made earlier. The distinction between export-led growth and import substituting industrialization is a false distinction. In this example, you see that import replacement then led on to export growth. And my point is that this kind of forced marriage, or let's say encouraged marriage, was being effected by these state officials who were monitoring what was happening on factory floors up and down Taiwan, decade after decade. And this, in this particular example, you see how it was that that Taiwan's upgrading was nudged. Taiwan's upgrading was nudged all the way through the period from the 1950s up till today. So this is a sort of institutional mechanism for industrial upgrading. What these Industrial Development Bureau officials and people in other parts of the Taiwan government, the same applies to Korea, the same applies to Japan, what they were doing all the time was they were monitoring the imports, even in the 1980s, with ICT technologies not nearly as well developed as today. They knew within 24 or 48 hours what had been imported into Taiwan or into Korea within that period. And that's what they were watching in order to then see where there was a possibility of replacing those imports with production from Taiwan manufacturers. They were doing this all the time, decade after decade. If you compare these East Asian countries with, for example, Chile, with Dominican Republic, with Jordan, with Malaysia, they're also small open economies. But the state has done much less than the East Asia to build up the domestic firm capabilities in the way that I was just describing for Taiwan, except in some narrow sectors. But the problem is because they haven't done this systematically and sort of comprehensively, these efforts to build up like the agro industries in Chile or copper mining in Chile, they haven't had much spillover effects on the rest of the economy. And this is one book which is a detailed account of Malaysia. You may think that Malaysia is a very successful country. Malaysia's income has been growing, no doubt. It's a high middle income country. But Shahid Youssef and his Japanese collaborator report in this book, Tiger Economies Under Threat, that there has been remarkably little spillover from the set of FDI, foreign firms producing within Malaysia. There's been little spillover from them into domestic firms, into the capabilities of domestic firms, and therefore they actually conclude that Malaysia's technological capacity is actually deteriorating. It's certainly constant. In other words, Malaysia's income has been going up, but its capabilities in production have not been going up at all correspondingly. So there's a divorce, there's a disjunction between an economy's income growth and its capability growth. And if there is this disjunction, income growth may not be sustained. It may go up and down like that, it may deteriorate. So it is important as a part of development strategy to focus on this question of how to build up the capabilities of domestic firms. I want to say something just very quickly about US industrial policy. You may be surprised to know that US has had an active industrial policy and over decades, but nobody knows about it, or rather almost nobody knows about it because it's been very well hidden. It's been practiced under the radar, and it takes the form of federal or state agencies which are themselves uncoordinated. Agencies like DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or the National Institutes of Health, or the National, what is it called, the National Bureau of Standards and Technology, something like that. The whole lot of agencies have had their own industrial policies that are not coordinated in one central place. So this is very different from East Asian industrial policy, where there were central coordination bodies, like in Japan, the famous MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry was the sort of coordinating body in Japan. The US hasn't had anything like that. But what these individual federal agencies have done is to build up networks, that's the key word, networks, amongst public laboratories and private labs, private firms, venture capitalists, build networks between these kind of entities and commissioning from the networks research that the agencies want them to do. So the agencies formulate a vision of the future of the sector that they deal with, and then they commission these networks of private firms, public laboratories, private laboratories, venture capitalists. They commission these networks to get on and innovate within that area. And if you look at, for example, Apple, you take Apple, everybody thinks that Steve Jobs is the great technological genius who invented all these products, and it's simply not true. Apple's genius, Steve Jobs' genius, was to take technological breakthroughs that had been developed in public laboratories with federal funding, state funding, in pursuit of a sort of state-formulated vision of the technological future, was to take these breakthroughs in the public, made by the public sector, and put them into very well-designed products. So the genius of Apple is design. It's not in technology innovation. So things like liquid crystal displays, hard drives, microprocessors, memory chips, and lithium-ion batteries, and a whole lot, and the algorithms that Apple has used, all these were invented in public laboratories. One of the great flaws of American industrial policy is that the public agencies, the public labs, have given these things to the private sector without getting any revenue back. That's the fundamental problem. So Apple has got very, very rich and benefited all of us without paying for the kind of innovations from the public sector that it has got rich on the back of. And that means that the funding for the public laboratory, the funding for these public innovations, is constantly squeezed because the state is not getting back a return. And that would be an obvious thing for the US state to do. One good source, by the way, on US industrial policy is this book by Mariana Mazzucato, who is at Sussex, the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex. It's called The Entrepreneurial State. This is mainly about US industrial policy. So my basic point is that even in the US, which most people say the US does not have an industrial policy, if you look closely, you can see that the state, or rather these decentralized agencies of the state, have taken quite strong entrepreneurial roles in a way which complements the entrepreneurial activity of the private sector rather than crowds out the public sector. Oh, just to elaborate that point a little bit more, the standard economic image of the role of the state presumes that the private sector is just like a lion, a caged lion, a lion in a cage, which is just waiting to spring free of all the state regulations. And that simply does not begin to correspond with the historical record. The state, in the catch-up countries, the state has played a much more entrepreneurial role than that image of the private sector being sort of held back by the public sector, and the task of government is simply to deregulate. That image is simply flatly not in line with the historical record. I wanted to say, before I come to the question of how to organize an industrial policy capacity, a capacity to make industrial policy, I just wanted to say something quickly about what's happened on the industrial policy front since 2008, since the crisis. There's a set of data available called the Global Trade Alert data, which has become available. And we know something about what countries have been doing on the industrial policy front from this data. So it includes the US, the EU, China, India, Brazil, Argentina, and some others. And the bottom line is that they've moved, since the crisis, further away from the idea, from the neoclassical or the neoliberal idea of the government just provides a level playing field on the assumption that the players will turn up to play. You can provide a level playing field, but what happens if nobody turns up to play? And that's what has been happening. So they're moving away from that. They're trying to kind of induce or force even the players to turn up to play. And so they've been intensifying policy selectivity, much of it under the banner of green, because green provides some legitimation. Just like in the US, much of US industrial policy was under the military banner, because that provided political coverage. And now the political coverage is coming from saying that what we're doing is in the interests of the environment. WTO rules. The question is, what effect WTO rules have? Because you might think that WTO rules would be very constraining, would make it very difficult for governments to move in an industrial policy direction. And that is true, but true to some extent. You have to look at WTO rules in terms of the degree to which different types of WTO rules constrain government actions. The most constraining of WTO rules are rules on tariffs, quantitative restrictions, local content requirements. Then there's a sort of medium category, that is tools which are medium constrained by WTO rules, and they include things like government procurement, intellectual property, export subsidies in agriculture, and some others. Then there is another category where governments are under very little constraint from WTO rules, and they include devaluations, they include investment incentives, that's very important, they include trade finance, export taxes. And actually, there's a lot of room for maneuver. If a government is determined to use industrial policy to promote certain sectors, there are ways to use even these sort of medium constrained, and maybe even these ones, if the government wishes to, without being sort of taken to the WTO dispute panels. What has happened, so that's actually the basic point. The WTO rules since the crisis have not so much affected the quantity of industrial policy, because the quantity of industrial policy has been going up. Governments have been using more of it. But WTO rules have rather affected the composition of the industrial policy instruments. Governments have tended to go for the medium or the low constraint instruments. Let me finish now on this note. I mean, it's a really important question. It's very important, very relevant in Palestine. The question is how to organize a governance capacity for industrial policy in middle-income countries. So I'm not talking specifically of Palestine, I'm talking of middle-income countries generally, where, at least in the sort of popular image, the public agencies in middle-income countries are commonly used as sources of patronage and sinecures. They allocate goods and services personalistically. And so if you set up an industrial policy agency to work in line with these principles, it's rather unlikely. It's unlikely that the agency will be effective in promoting national industry. And so the broad point is that in middle-income countries, industrial policy agencies commonly operate, or would operate if the agencies existed, in an environment which is rather hostile for effectiveness. However, if you look around the world, you can see in various countries what have been called pockets of excellence, or islands of excellence, or pockets of effectiveness. That is, you find cases in middle-income countries where, generally speaking, the bureaucracy works in a sort of personalistic, cronyistic kind of way. You can find examples of public agencies that just stand out because they really are effective. They do what they're meant to do in an effective way. And here are some examples. These are just some of quite a number of examples. The first one is the National Bank for Economic Development of Brazil, BNDES. The second one would be Embrapa, which is the Agricultural Research Agency, again in Brazil. In Nigeria, there's the National Agency for Food and Drug Administration. In Suriname, there's the State Oil Company. South Korea had the Economic Planning Board. Taiwan had the Industrial Development Bureau, and so on. And so if you put all these together, you can ask the question of what they have in common. How is it that they manage to remain as to operate in an effective kind of way? And I'm just going to run through a number of what I think are necessary, not sufficient, but necessary conditions of policy effectiveness for industrial policy. So the first one is that the head of government, or a small coherent elite, has to demonstrate a strong interest in the particular tasks being done effectively. So in this case, the head of government, or the immediate elite around the head of government, has to be very much committed to developing the capacities of domestically based industry, not just foreign firms operating in the territory, and may have several kinds of motives for having this strong industry, this strong interest. So that's the first point. The head of government, or somebody very, very powerful, has to be particularly interested in the question of how to develop the capacities of domestic industry, and not simply rely on foreign firms to come in as a substitute for developing the capacity of domestic industry. The second thing has to do with how the head of the industrial policy agency is appointed. And here the point is that the criteria for appointment have to break with the kind of standard criteria which, if you take my general characterization, which are personalistic or cronyistic, they have to break with that, even against quite a lot of opposition. So the criteria have to include things like technical qualification, proven leadership, proven incorruptibility. That's the first point. The second point is that the director has to come from outside the immediate elite, because it's really important that the agency which the director heads has a degree of bureaucratic autonomy. I'll come back to that point. So the director cannot be too intimate with the elite, even though the director needs a strong tie with the head of government or with somebody very close to the head of government. And so that means that the director is not selected simply by formal bureaucratic procedures, which would get at this, because in addition to these things, the director has to have this close relationship with the head of government in order to be able to maintain the degree of bureaucratic autonomy that this industrial policy agency needs. And so that brings me to the point about autonomy. Bureaucratic autonomy is necessary because the agency will conflict with politicians, and it will especially conflict with firms that have been getting trade protection and which wish to continue the trade protection even though they're not meeting the quality, the performance standards associated with the trade protection. Firms will lobby very hard to keep their trade protection, and the agency has to have enough autonomy to withdraw the trade protection and also subsidies and so on if they're not performing. And there is here a paradox, because we think of autonomy meaning simply separate, not interacting with. But in this case, autonomy is achieved by precisely the opposite. That is, autonomy is achieved by having intense relationships with other kinds of political figures in order to maintain the autonomous status, the autonomous operation of the agency. So autonomy is not just a matter of separation. It's inherently a relational thing that has to be negotiated, maintained all the time. And that's one reason why the commitment of the head of government to the effective operation of the agency is so critically important in order to maintain the autonomy, to allow it to operate with very standardized procedures, to allow it to be independently, its performance to be independently monitored on a regular kind of basis. So that's the autonomy paradox. And this last point is really just to repeat something that I've kept emphasizing, but I will emphasize it yet again. Industrial policy assistance must be made conditional on the performance of firms, that is to say, as judged by movement towards international competitiveness, so that it buffers them. The subsidies, the protection buffers them from international competitive pressures, but does not remove it. So they're allowed to have a chance to establish themselves against, for example, Chinese competition. And so it will include, industrial policies will include things like sunset clauses. In the case of Taiwan, the Taiwan government gave quite elaborate, what they called fiscal investment incentives to firms. So a firm making electrical equipment, for example, would be eligible for receiving a big tax write-down if it was producing electrical equipment above a certain threshold of capacity. And this threshold of capacity is what was critical in the design of the instrument, because the threshold of capacity was always set at just at the top of the level of ability of Taiwan firms at any one point of time. And as more firms began to cross that threshold and meet that level of capacity, so the capacity level kept being raised, so that firms had to keep looking at the frontier in order to be sure of getting the fiscal investment incentives. A maker of fluorescent lights, let's say, might get fiscal investment incentives if the fluorescent light produced was above a certain kind of quality. But as more and more fluorescent light makers were able to meet that level of quality, so the standard was raised. And so the fiscal investment incentives just kept being targeted at the frontier of production in Taiwan over the decades. That's another way by which the incentives can be linked to performance. So let me just run over the main points. Virtually all the successful cases of economic development have involved a state being more proactive than the Washington Consensus or the Standard Development Strategy has allowed. The states have gone well beyond the idea that our role is to fix market failures in the events that markets fail, but generally markets do not fail, so generally we don't intervene. The role of the state has been much more entrepreneurial than that. Since 2008, industrial policy has intensified in most advanced countries and in emerging market economies, especially under the protection, the political protection of we are doing this for the sake of the environment and to save energy. But you always have to remember that state intervention can certainly destroy markets. It can impede development, and there's a long history of states impeding development. And so the key question then is this one, how to create effective industrial policy agencies which do not destroy markets, do not impede development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think a lot of people here would very much love what you have explained, because we've been receiving always advices that want to limit the role of the state and that always favor free market, despite the fact that our market is captive and occupied. In this time, it is valuable for us, for our experience, because we will be driven by necessity. We have to restructure our industry. our industry is no longer competitive as a result of of the fact that it is traditional, and our inputs for this kind of traditional industries is not cheap. Traditional industries usually can compete in the international markets on the basis of the cheap labor. Our labor cost is that high that exceeds maybe the cost in some European countries. So in order to compete, to produce something where we can compete, we have to move towards high value products and knowledge rich products in all sectors, not only in industry, in agriculture, and maybe services and others. And here the modernization of our industry, the transformation of our industry towards that end is imminent and is very much needed. I don't want to take much of time. I just want to go back. I'm asked here to facilitate discussion with you, not with me, and would very much welcome short comments and questions for our distinguished speaker. We'll start with Sam. Microphones, we need 2 microphones to run, or 3, so we can you manage the time properly.
Thank you. I've attended many lectures in this room, and I must say that your talk was a breath of fresh air. I have a couple quick questions. One is, in the agencies that you mentioned that have been successful, can you talk a little bit about the governing agents, the governing bodies that oversee these agencies, both in the legislative branch of government, and how the judiciary came up to speed to be able to understand industrial policy and to support the industrial policy when dispute rises? Also, are there similar examples you can give from a services-based policy, assuming that when you say industrial, you're meaning more manufacturing here? And lastly, has anyone hired you in Palestine yet?
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask you, I didn't catch your second question. What was the second one?
In terms of governing the oversight of you have agencies that have been created, but what are the I mean, the states, for example, an agency would be overseen by state legislator. Is it also centralized?
Yeah.
Because that's a major issue here, is that we create agencies because we have a failed political system, that there's not oversight of the agencies created. So that's why I'm trying to lead you to give us advice. What kind of proper oversight is needed for these agencies?
Okay, Aqil. Dr. Aqil.
Thank you. My name is Aqil Abqala. I have 2 questions. Question number 1, you mentioned the concept of quality, and you give the example of Taiwan and India, and then the Chinese product. Looking at the Palestinian product, how could you advise the Palestinian government within the umbrella of industrial policy you talk about, the selective intervention, that help equality as a concept for the Palestinian product to compete? This is the first question. The second question, you mentioned certain concept that production transformation, development, and employment. Looking at the Palestinian economy, the Palestinian situation, which is mainly rely on consumer spending, consumption, do you see really any real development for the Palestinian economy or sustainable development? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sabri.
Hi, my name is Sabri Said. I'm a board member of MAS. I love the way you articulated the importance of leadership for evolution in economic development. But I have to beg to differ with you on the basis that collecting different technologies in a device does not deprive you from the fact that you are a genius. So the way you addressed Steve Jobs is something that really caused some anxiety in me, because I have been working with liquid crystals for a while. I have been in the processor technology, and I have not been able to see somebody who has managed to articulate the collection of many technologies and put them in a device such as the iPhone and the iPad and the tablet technology. And you come now and deprive the man of his right of being a genius simply because you disagree and you say that he built on previous technologies. Indeed, that's the case, but I think you've been a bit harsh.
Thank you. Samira Taylor.
Thank you. Samir Hanele. I'm also in the board of MAS, but not on that base I'm putting my comment here. I am for more proactive role for government in the economy. However, I need to ask specific questions about Palestine. First is, you're talking about the role of state. What if the state is not a state? What if the state is not empowered to do that? And what if the state has other priorities? Not the economic anyway. It could be other political or other social. How can we articulate the role of the state vis-a-vis the private sector in this context, or vis-a-vis the economy in this context? And what if the state was busy solving political issues, however people has to invest and survive and employ and being employed, and there is no vision and there is no plan? What shall we do? Shall we wait? I'll give you an example. The state till now have done a maximum of 3 years plan, maximum. Midterm plans, 3 years. We as private sector have done a 17 years plan, a vision, for example. You said that the vision is usually done by the state and the private sector do something tangible next year or the year after. I'm telling you it's exactly the opposite in our case. So I think we need just to digest what you have said about other experiences and try to define and design really a good formula of intervention in the Palestinian case. That's how I can really benefit from such a lecture. Thank you very much.
Can I reply to some of these?
This is the last round, the last one in this round, then we'll...
My name is Luan Musa. On your last section, when you talked about conditions and requirements for the BOEs, you mentioned about the need for a small number of elite. You know, the elite would be a small number that would spearhead this this IP effort. The question I have is, I mean, this uses a threat of maybe corruptibility, or if the policy is not institutionalized, that it's confined to a small number of people, okay, there's room for things going bad. The other question is the different experiences of East Asia, specifically South Korea. Is there a need for, I'm talking about wages, I'm talking about the role of unions, is there a need for competition to, because we know in the early stages, the government in South Korea and other East Asian, they were ruled by military dictatorships. There was very strong, repressive measures to keep wages down, to restrict union activity for the sake of, competitiveness. Do you see, what do you think about that?
Thank you. The floor is yours, Mr. Wade.
Okay, well, the easiest one to deal with is from Sabri's Saidam. I hope that I made it clear, I thought I made it clear, I do think Steve Jobs was a genius, but not a genius in technology, a genius in design, but that is in no way to reduce his genius. My point is that there was a complementarity, not a competitiveness. The state made the big technological breakthroughs, that is the public laboratories themselves, or the public laboratories commissioning work from the private sector in these things like liquid crystal displays and microprocessors and hard drives and so on. And then he took these and put them together into products, and there's no question at that second step is a step of genius, as he did it, and his designer, Johnny Ives. So I don't mean in any way to diminish that achievement, but the reason why I'm making that example is because in general, in the public in general, Apple innovated all these things. Apple developed the technologies and so on, and that is simply not true. That common story simply ignores the key role of the state in developing these breakthrough technologies. And so the common story fits with this wider story of the private sector is like a lion or a caged lion, a lion in a cage, which is just waiting to jump free from all the state restrictions placed upon it. I have to say I work for the World Bank. I know and I like the World Bank. I think the world needs an organization like the World Bank. However, I think that it has done quite a lot of damage by propagating that idea that in all these developing countries there is a sort of potential private sector just waiting to spring free from state regulations. So the job of the state is just to kind of deregulate, get out of the way, and let these private entrepreneurs get on with it. That is simply deeply misleading in terms of the historical record of how development has come about. There's been much more complementarity between the states and private markets in the cases where there was success, just as there are many cases where the state has destroyed markets, has really impeded development. Both are true. And so, as I said earlier, one response to protection is we must do less trade protection. The other response is to say protection is a powerful instrument. Like any powerful instrument, it can be used well or it can be used badly. It is often used badly, but it can be used well, and we have historical examples of how it has been used well, that is well in order to advance a development, to improve a development process. Anyway, so that was the answer to the question of Steve Jobs' genius. He was a genius, but in design, not in technology. There have been several questions about the future of Palestine, and the questions convey the kind of pessimism, the deep pessimism about all the restrictions there are on Palestine's development, a kind of sense of almost hopelessness. For example, you said the state may be busy with political issues. It may not be concerned with industrialization. But look, just go back to what I said about Taiwan. For an economy with a population of 22 million people, it had a very small agency of about 150 engineers, which operated this industrial extension service that visited factories up and down the country all the time, decade after decade. Is it completely infeasible to think of Palestine developing a similar kind of agency? Maybe you would need only, 50 engineers, 70 engineers, whatever the figure may be. That's not a huge resource commitment relative to the potential advantages of pushing out technical advice, hands-on technical advice to firms across the industrial sectors that are operating within Palestine and those which might be developed. This is small-scale industrial policy. It doesn't involve picking winners in the kind of East Asian sense, like the Koreans went into steel, and so on. It involves industrial policy of a sort of nudging kind, without great state resources at stake. That is, the cost of screwing up, so to speak, is not very much. But as I understand it, there is really nothing of this kind. I was talking with a senior figure from Maas before this talk who said, well, we have a trade promotion organization, as though a trade promotion organization was a sort of substitute for the industrial extension service that I was talking about. And not at all. The Trade Promotion Agency is about how to open up markets in Europe and so on and so on. It doesn't get involved with what's happening on the factory floor. And what seems to be missing here is some sort of state push, public sector push for improvements at the factory floor. Let's see, what else? On the first question about the governing bodies of the pockets of excellence that I identified, that is a really interesting question, and the short answer is that I just don't know. It would be interesting, for example, to look at the literature about DARPA. DARPA is by far and away the most successful industrial policy agency possibly in the world, certainly in the United States, because DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the word defense is very important because it puts it under the defense umbrella and keeps it out of the line of fire of Republicans. But DARPA has, over the decades, commissioned many breakthrough technologies across ICTs, across biotech, across nanotech, and so on. So it would be very interesting to know how it is that DARPA has managed to keep below the radar, so out of the sight of the Republicans who hate all this kind of stuff. And that would link directly to your question about the governing bodies, but unfortunately I really don't know anything more about that. So, I also don't know anything about the future of the Palestinian economy. Just let me repeat the point. It doesn't seem beyond the wit of man to institute something like an industrial extension service to get out and help people like the shoemaker in Hebron, who, as I said, is supply constrained. He's not demand constrained. He could double his production, but he can't. And he can't because his factory is hopelessly inefficient. And day by day, he has no incentive to kind of restructure it. But with an outside push, he could.
Thank you. Second round was, but I want to encourage those who want to talk in Arabic. Mr. Wade can understand.
No, I
He
can't.
has Okay, Amir, but I want to ask you to be a little bit shorter than the previous intervention, so we can have better participation.
No, I'm going to speak in English. Anyhow, my name is Amir Noor. I'm working at Ministry of Planning. Thanks for the very interesting lecture, and I'm very happy to raise some questions. First of all, to start with Adam Smith, this is a very successful story to speak about development. And you have also raised the three factors which were the development strategy of Adam Smith based, that is peace, easy taxation. Of course, this is not applicable on Palestine because we have no peace yet. Still, we are under occupation and our resources are under occupation. But my question is to raise a question about your lecture itself. First, you speak that USA has industrial policy, high industrial policy. I believe in that. Second thing, this and the industrial policy which you have defined, you define it as selective assistance strategies. State gives selective assistance to some sectors. In the other part, you raise the questions that the assistance must be made conditional on performance. This is very much affiliated with the tools which the international capitalism is created in the world, that is World Trade Organizations and other instruments, and World Bank also, to facilitate for the big capitalist countries who have already developed their industries, who have followed all protections, all type of protections to raise up their industries. I have very good experience about the Korean economy, the Indian economy, and the Chinese economy, how the protectionism is used on a very wide scale. In the third part of your lecture, you said that state intervention can also destroy market.
Thank you.
No, but just one minute. Another thing I feel that is one thing is missing, that is the monetary policies. You have not, since you are talking about development, you have concentrated more on the physical, and the monetary issues are absent. How when the Americans diverted from the international gold standards, and how it has affected other economies.
Thank you. أعطيله اللي وراك والله لترتير.
Thank you, Robert. Great to have you here. My name is Ala Tartir, and I'm the program director of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and PhD candidate at LSE as well. You talked about the World Bank and the resistance to the industrial policies. And the World Bank is a leading arm or the key actor in the aid industry in the occupied Palestinian territory. And the Palestinian economy is heavily dependent on international aid. And for many scholars, when we talk about development, we talk by default also about the aid industry. And Palestinian economy received more than $23 billion over the last 2 decades. My question, how these aid funds and aid industry play in this game? Where does it fit? And also, can you give us a few rule of thumb?
Sorry, just let me clarify, where does the aid industry fit in which game?
And the whole, exactly, the IP, basically, the industrial policies, where, because it is so heavily, because the economy is so heavily dependent on that aid. So in terms of theoretical understanding, where does it fit? And can you share with us a few rule of thumbs or on how we can affect the priorities of the donor community in order to pay their attention that there is something concrete that can be happen instead of wasting their money?
Thank you. Can you pass it to قبلك رجل معلش بعدين رجل. Go ahead.
شكرا. First of all, I would like to thank you, really thank you for the really valuable lecture.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Rajan Shahin. I'm a researcher at Bisan Center. I would say first of all that actually, I don't know if you know that the only, at least to the best of my knowledge, the only place in the world where the Constitution goes in its Article 21 here in Ramallah that we adopt a free market economy. So this is constitutional, and you are against the Constitution to ask the state to come back if I am to bring back Evans and Scotland. So here we are, free market stuff. But I like to think if there is really a possibility when you are free in Palestine with good governance and with democracy, that's the prescription of the World Bank, to do a lot here. I don't know if there is any serious, from your point of view, possibility of development in the PA's territories with the prescriptions of the World Bank.
Thank you.
Secondly, I would like to ask you about Malaysia. I'm sort of stuck in the issue of Malaysia. And I recall that you wrote about a sort of exceptional performance by Mahathir Mohamad and Malaysia in the 1990s crisis, but now Malaysia is stuck. Though Mahathir Mohamad did not lack all the stuff of the leadership that you mentioned, I guess he was so aggressive when it comes to the relationship between the government and capital. He knew very well how to subsidize and to support the successful sectors of the industry. He has definitely an industrial policy, but at the end of the day, he didn't make that great success.
Thank you.
Another point, only one point. I want to ask, do you think seriously, I mean from a theoretical point of view, that everyone is liable, everyone is possibly able to catch up? Can we dream of a capitalist world in which everybody, every country, every state is successful? Or is it rather to bring Emmanuel Warishtin, Amin and the stuff, it is a world system where you produce poverty all the time in the peripheries and that you are not free? Here in Ramallah we compete, the government, the Palestinian Authority, and the NGOs to get the Western funding. That's our game. And we are actually structured and shaped by their agenda. Nobody here is free. And I guess there are many people in the world, many states, many countries who are not free to choose their track. And the elites are not free. You can easily buy elites everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Professor Wade, first I'd like to commend Mass for being the one place in this, for being the one place in this town where in the space of 2 weeks we can have the thesis and the antithesis in the same hall, namely the lecture 2 weeks ago by the World Bank and today yours. So that's a plus for Mass, even though outside Mass perhaps, thinking is perhaps more one direction, unidirectional. And as far as the many topics you covered, I know you wanted, one of the options was to talk about the rise of China, and you touched on that, but luckily I think because it's a very complex issue here and very problematic, the same issue of trade protection from Chinese imports, and you've seen Hebron, etc. I won't go into that. But the issue that I think that you're also one of the issues you're expert on, and which has concerned those of us in the multilateral economic governance system in the last years, is precisely the extent to which the institutions that are so prevalent, the bank and the fund, within the institutions and in their practices and in their preaching, have they really learned the lessons of the crisis, in your view? You referred to a few things. I mean, we've all seen noises and smelt sort of certain signals coming out from these institutions here and there. But do you think that there's been a really serious reconsideration of the whole package, not only the IP package? And have you seen it on the ground in any of the developing countries? Can we hope, basically, I think the question was posed to the World Bank last time, how long are you going to keep telling us this stuff and when are you going to leave? And the answer is basically we're not leaving. So do you think that, there's any shift
Thank you.
underway?
طيب في الستات ما حدش حكى منهم شو القصة؟ ما في اهتمام بالاندستريال بوليسي للستات. إذا ما فيش أعطينا للسيد نورهان. Nurhan. In your back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reid, for a very interesting lecture. My name is Nurhan Nikšić. I'm with the World Bank. And first thing I want to tell you that actually I agree with you that markets are definitely not sufficient, and markets very often don't work. And I can also tell you that there are a lot of colleagues whom I work with in the World Bank who share that view. And I think the World Bank has been going through a transformation. I don't know if it's now where you want to see it, but I see a lot of transformation. My question to you is, in a country with weak governance, in a country where institutions which are set up to, in the name, support the private sector and support industrial policy, but in fact are set up oftentimes to promote the interests of particular groups. How do you set up institutions that promote industrial policy for the broader benefit of the society? Do you first have to work on a broader governance or agenda, or is it possible to somehow set up these islands in isolation from the overall governance environment of a country? How do you prioritize interventions? And also, I have a second question, which is related to Palestine. In an environment where the government does not control 60% of the territory in the West Bank, where any economic activity in 60% of the West Bank is not possible because of restrictions, where trade is severely restricted. It's almost impossible to import anything from Gaza to the West Bank, where it's almost impossible to import much of the machinery because they're considered dual-use goods. How effective would industrial policy be if you don't address those other things which may be currently the binding constraint on the economic development?
Thank you. Last, okay, Mr. Turkey.
This is Fatih Turgay. I'm commercial teacher of Turkey. I'd like to ask you something Mr. Wade, could you please give us some information about UK experience in the industrial policy? It's very striking for me, you exclude UK policy in your presentation. If it's not secret, could you tell us why? And if you know anything about UK industrial policy, I would be very happy to hear about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shahada.
For a change, I have a very short question. To what extent do you think that the agricultural subsidies policies of the US and Europe are part of what you describe as industrial policies? And I feel that you have left out those policies, although they are very important for the agricultural sector. And to what extent do you consider these as benevolent industrial policies from your viewpoint? Thank you.
Thank you. خلاص, shall we? Please go ahead.
I wanted to begin with the questions from, sorry, what is your name again?
Orhan.
Orhan, from the World Bank. You suggested that the World Bank has been or is being transformed, and I want to put to you a question, but I'll begin further back. I worked in the bank in the 1980s, and I saw the transformation. When I went there in 1984, there were many technologists, engineers employed at the World Bank who would go out and give advice about the chemical sector or about the electrical sector or whatever it was that their expertise was in. At just that time, they began to be either fired from the World Bank or they were invited to retrain to become experts in primary education or in public health or in good governance or in environmental assessments. And the bank moved just radically away from the idea that it had any role in helping to build industry in developing countries. So you are right in the sense that about 3 weeks ago, one vice presidency at the bank, the Finance and Private Sector Development Vice Presidency, had a conference which had the words industrial policy in the title, and several people spoke about industrial policy. But this is the first time in decades that this has ever happened. And so you can't, you know, there's this expression in English, one swallow does not make a spring. Spring is not signaled by the arrival of one swallow. And so the arrival of one conference by one vice presidency on industrial policy does not mean any significant shift in broad thinking. When I did my research in the World Bank in 2010, I encountered very strong hostility to the very idea. However, the vice president of that same vice presidency, Finance and Private Sector Development, was interested in having some pilot projects on industrial policy. I think one was in Jordan, one was in India, in Vietnam, in Kazakhstan. So he put together a small group of people to organize these pilot projects to give selective assistance to certain industries in those countries. But they did it in top secret, or rather they never used the phrase industrial policy. It was called the Competitive Partnerships Initiative. And I asked the person why they called it that, and he said because nobody could object to any of those three words. Everybody likes competition, everybody likes partnerships, everybody likes initiatives. So that was 2010. And one of the so the question to you is: has the bank been employing, as part of this transformation and thinking that you talk about, has it been employing engineers? Has it been employing technologists? My guess is no, but that is my guess. One problem with the way that the bank thinks about industrial policy is that because it equates industrial policy with sort of big-scale picking winners, like Korea picked the steel industry. When the World Bank in 1970 said to Korea, don't go into steel, steel is not your comparative advantage, Korea went ahead and made a success of it. The World Bank still thinks that industrial policy means that kind of really big state-led initiative. And one of the points I've been trying to emphasize here is that there's a whole range of instruments and scales of industrial policy, and at one end, at the other end from Korea picking steel, there is the kind of thing that the Taiwan Industrial Development Bureau was doing year after year after year. Somebody asked about the prospects for Palestine developing, and let me just, Palestinian industry developing, let me just repeat the point I've been trying to make, which is that it is surely possible for a relatively small group of engineers, they may not be clearly public officials, they may be sort of parastatal on the edge of the state, employed under somewhat different employment arrangements. But it's possible to get a pool of these people to go out and visit factories across many sectors in Palestine to give advice about how to improve the production layout, how to improve the kind of machine tools that are being used, and so on and so on. That is small scale. That doesn't depend on the approval of the Israeli government. That can be done, very soon. What needs to happen is that some people at the top of the Palestinian Authority become committed to doing this, rather than to simply see Palestine as continuing as a place where people are kept alive and where there's a development of some services and some kind of wines, but not any kind of development of industry. My sense is that there seems to be a kind of resignation to the elimination of Palestinian industry because of Chinese competition, or because we must practice free trade. We must get imports, we must get products from wherever the cheapest sources of supply is, ignoring the question of what happens to employment and income generation within Palestine. So I don't think that there is justification for this sense of defeatism that I have encountered in the last few days. Somebody asked about the role of finance, the short answer is that I don't know. I don't have a clear answer to the question, what is the role of finance? But what I will say is this, that in economics textbooks, finance tends to be presented as simply the lubricant or the oil of the economy. And just as oil does not make the engine go, but oil is necessary for the engine, so people say finance is just kind of passive. You must have finance, but it doesn't have any influence over the real economy. That is fundamentally wrong. And we should have learned well before 2008 that idea, money as a veil over the real economy, is fundamentally wrong. But if we learn anything from 2008, it must be that finance can become a very active destroyer of economies. It can boost economic growth quite artificially because it's on the basis of people buying things on debt, on credit. But then it can destroy, and that's what has been happening. So the role of finance has to, as the person who asked the question is quite right, the role of finance has to be brought much more centrally into development, but it has to be regarded as potentially very dangerous. Just to give you a case, this is from Britain. Mark Carney, who is the rock star, like the Bono of central banking, as Bono is to rock music, brought in on a very high salary from the Bank of Canada. He really shocked me and a number of other people just a few weeks ago when he said, look, the ratio of bank assets to British GDP, British bank assets to British GDP, is 4 times. I expect that by 2020 it could rise to 9 times. Why? Because finance is Britain's comparative advantage. And when I read this, I was deeply shocked because it seemed that he has no idea about the dangers of having a large financial sector in an economy, because the financial sector is always wanting to blow up bubbles, because bubbles are very good for financial profits. And if you have bubbles, then you're very likely to have crashes, as we have seen only too clearly. So finance, yes, it should have been brought much more centrally into my argument and indeed into the literature. Finance has been neglected in development studies generally, but it has to be treated as something which is potentially very dangerous. I think I will stop at that point. You said the Palestinian economy...
No, about the changes in the bank thinking.
Yeah, well, I just don't see this as happening more than skin deep, at least so far. And there's a question of whether, there's a big question of whether Dr. Jim Kim, the new president of the bank, whose background is in public health in the poorest economies, like Haiti and in Rwanda, whether he has any interest whatsoever in these things. He has an interest in making very poor people making very poor people more healthy, but in still poor countries. To have countries not remain very poor, you need much more than public health, kind of low-level interventions that he seems to be very keen on. So I'm worried about the future of the bank, and I've actually written about the inside politics of how it was that Dr. Kim came to be made president of the bank. And that is quite an interesting and a rather sad story, given that I think the World Bank is a very important institution in the world economy and should be protected by its members and not just left to be dominated by the Americans.
Just last football note. Is Washington consensus still alive?
Well, the Washington consensus, this phrase is very contentious, partly because it meant one thing when John Williamson coined it in 1990 as the list of things that most people concerned with development living in Washington. That was very important. So that means mainly the IMF, the World Bank, the US Treasury, USAID, the things that they all agreed on. And so, for example, he excluded from the Washington Consensus free capital mobility, free capital movement. He excluded that because he said there's not a consensus on whether that's a good thing or not. But subsequently, that particular item, the need for free capital movements, has been added by later people, so that many people think the Washington Consensus includes free capital mobility. And of course, the Americans and the Europeans very much want to encourage that belief that the Washington Consensus, everybody in Washington agrees that there should be free capital mobility. And it's interesting that this is how it all goes into governance issues. The BRICS, the 5 countries that make up the BRICS, very surprisingly are beginning to concert their actions. They're beginning to act like a group, although you would think they have almost nothing in common, but they are beginning to act as a group. And one thing that they're acting as a group on is to prevent the Europeans from lowering the ceiling for the supermajority inside the IMF. The current ceiling is 85%. The Americans have more than 15% of the votes, so the Americans can block any issue, any change that requires a supermajority, so the Americans can block any change in the Articles of Agreement of the bank. The Europeans want that lowered from 85 to 75%, because then the Europeans could exercise much more power if they all get together and pool their votes. One of the things that the BRICS oppose the Europeans in bringing down the supermajority from 85 to 75%. One reason is because if it's put at 85%, the BRICS together have more than 15%, so they can veto any proposed change. one thing they really, really want to be sure they can veto is the American and the European wish to remove Article 6 of the IMF Constitution. Article 6 gives member states the right to restrict capital flows, and the Europeans and the Americans want to remove that right from the Constitution of the IMF, and the BRICS want to make sure that they can always veto an American change which would remove that right for free capital mobility. So anyway, you asked, is the Washington Consensus still in existence? I mean, basically, the answer is basically yes, with some qualifications. The kind of way of seeing that I've been talking about, that begins with the idea that market signals are good for promoting incremental change, but not good for promoting discontinuous changes, big diversifications, and so on. That basic way of seeing is not part of the way the World Bank and the IMF and all these other organizations are thinking. They're still very committed to free trade, for example.
You didn't answer my question about whether you think there is seriously any possibility that all the states will catch up. And also
the answer is no. There's no possibility that all the states will catch up. But I will say one final thing. The Washington Consensus is still in force, but by 2050 it will be the end of neoliberalism, because climate change will, as climate change begins to really kick in, neoliberalism will just evaporate. It's no longer viable in a world where governments are seriously faced with adjusting to climate change.
طيب, at the end, let me, on your behalf, all thank our distinguished speakers and thank you for attending. And you all now invited for a small reception, so you can talk also with our speaker if he has some time.